Well, hey y'all, and welcome to our Wednesday night Bible study as we return to looking at the story of Joseph. So get your Bibles out, get to Genesis, and we'll get going in just a second. But before we do, I wanted to let you know of a couple things that I thought of. This is typically our Wednesday night Bible study and prayer meeting time. So if you have a prayer need that we can join with you in praying for, add it as a comment to this video. If you don't feel comfortable with that, send it to us in a message, send us an email. Give us a call. We would love in this time to be in prayer with you and for you, ministering to you however we can. Also, I wanted to let you know our Annie Armstrong Easter offering came up just under $50 short of our $2,000 goal. But that's just so far. Even though Easter's passed, we're going to continue going until we reach our goal. So if you would help us, we'd be very grateful. A lot of ways to do it. Mail in checks, bring by money if you want to. You can also go to emmanuelbaptistpc.org/give and give online as well. But we do want to reach that goal. We do want to support missions in every way we can. But get your Bible out, get to Genesis, and get ready as we continue the story of Joseph. Thank y'all so much for being with us. All right, and as we pick up where we left off in the story of Joseph, you remember this is a kid. He was 17 years old when everything started to seemingly go wrong for him. One thing after another. He's rejected and passed down, one thing after another. And he ends up in the prison of the king. He's in there innocent. He's been lied about, yet he's sitting there. Remember, he faithfully interprets the dreams of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. They come out exactly as he said they would, and yet the cupbearer, who is the one still alive, forgot all about Joseph. And that's where we find him when we pick back up here in chapter 41 of Genesis. And it starts with such a key phrase that sets sort of the stage and the emotional stage for everything. It says, after 2 whole years. This is after the cupbearer has completely forgot about him. And he forgot about him for 2 whole years. Certainly this man was happy to be restored to his position, but when he did, he forgot about what got him there. And he forgot all about Joseph for 2 whole years. That's 730 days that this guy, who has been through so much already, sat, waiting, hoping, and every day ending in disappointment. But 2 whole years later, it says, then Pharaoh had a dream. This is a good thing because Pharaoh's dreams were a big deal. Got everybody's attention, especially if his dreams were to upset him. In this dream, he sees 7 cows coming out of the Nile. And these cows are fat and they're healthy. They're good-looking cows. Get some good steaks off these cows. And then he looks and he says, coming out of the Nile are 7 thin and ugly cows. But then the thin cows ate the healthy fat cows, and he's confused. That doesn't make any sense because they're actually still thin and still gross. And he was like, what in the world? After that, some grain pops up. And the first bit of grain is very healthy, 7 ears of grain, very healthy. And then 7, it says blighted by the east wind grains, and thin grains pop up. And then they swallow the good grains, and they're still thin and they're still gross. Pharaoh wakes up, he's confused, he doesn't know what's going on. Remember, the Egyptians put a lot of weight in dreams. So he calls in all his magicians and all his wise men, and he calls them all in and he's asked for the interpretation of this dream. No one's able to tell him what's going on. And you got to think that when you're the highest person in the known world at the time, your rank is above everyone else's, and you can't get an answer, I bet that gets a little frustrating. But the cupbearer, who's one of the closest people to him, remembers, it's my bad. And listen to actually how he says it. When the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today. He said, oh, this is terrible. I have forgotten this guy. And then he goes on to tell Pharaoh about this guy Joseph, this Hebrew who was in jail with him and gave him the correct interpretation of dreams that he and the baker had. Interesting to note, remember this entire time Joseph has been in jail, but he has been running the jail, seemingly learning a lot, being exposed to a lot, living a lot of life, but disappointed. In this point, the cupbearer remembers, he explains to Pharaoh the situation with this guy Joseph, and Pharaoh immediately says, get him here. So then they take Joseph, they immediately bring him up, and it actually says they bring him up out of the pit. If you'll remember back, that's what his brothers threw him into. Then it says he was thrown into prison, but Joseph said he viewed it as a pit. So now he's finally being brought up out of the pit that started with his brothers throwing him in one. He then, and I'm not a big fan of this part in verse 14, they brought him out of the pit and they shaved him and changed his clothes. I mean, a change of clothes is fine, but who actually wants to shave? It sounds terrible. And in this time we're living in, this is a great time since we're all stuck at home to not shave. So I recommend all men grow beards everywhere in order to follow the Lord and not the king of Pharaoh. But aside from that, he calls him in. He calls Joseph. And Pharaoh says that I hear you can interpret dreams. But Joseph, in the way he's always lived his life, he says, it's not for me, but God will give you an answer. Remember, back when he was first thrown in prison, they saw that the Lord was with him and made him successful. Potiphar saw that the Lord was with him and made him successful. All of Joseph's life has been a testimony of God being with him. Because remember, the most important thing we always see about Joseph is the phrase, the Lord was with Joseph. And now everybody's getting to see it as well. So then Pharaoh explains to him the dream he had about the cows and the grain and the wheat and everything. And Joseph says, well, here's the deal. It's a bit of God's grace, really, because God has shown you what he's going to do. He said there's going to be 7 years of plenty, 7 years of abundance of food. Harvests are going to be great. But then after that, there's going to be 7 really bad years of severe famine. And he said, because you actually saw this dream revealed to you in 2 different forms, the cows and the grain, then it means it is set firm by God, and it's going to happen, and it's going to happen soon. So then, verse 34, Joseph not only interprets the dream, but then Joseph gives him suggestions. He says, look, Pharaoh, proceed to appoint overseers of the land. Take 1/5 of the produce of the land during the plentiful years. He's saying, store these things, store all this food, so that you can have a reserve during the hard times. And what I love about this is that Joseph is able to give this advice with, of course, wisdom from God, but also wisdom that he's gained from managing Potiphar's house and managing a prison. And even though those moments where it seemed like Joseph was in misery and there, he was innocent, but he was still being tormented and nothing was going right. But he was actually learning valuable skills that he would use to save a lot of people. And I think it's so true in my own life. I have to remember that things that we go through, we have to remember that they are sovereignly placed there by God. And if we focus on God, they have the ability to make us into what he wants us to be. But if we focus on our own selves and our own comfort only, then they won't make us, but they'll break us. We want to be made into useful for God's kingdom, not broken into uselessness. So Pharaoh hears this. He's pleased by the whole thing. It starts in verse 37. And it says that Pharaoh says, in whom can we find another person like this with the Spirit of God on them? He again sees Joseph's life as a testimony. He says, God has shown you all this. There's none as discerning and as wise as you. And then in verse 40, you hear the same thing described about Joseph that was done in Potiphar's house and in the prison. When somebody throws him into something, he gets elevated. And he says, you shall be over my house, and all of my people will order themselves at your command. Only in regards to the throne will the Pharaoh, be over you. Joseph is put in charge of everything. He's then, ironically, given fine linen clothes and a gold chain. So he gets back to sort of the fancy clothes that got him into trouble with his brothers. To begin with, he goes on to say that everybody is going to bow the knee when Joseph rides his chariot around. And then, as the story goes, Joseph is also blessed with a wife. The Pharaoh gives him a wife. And then he's blessed with 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Through all this, it's really cool because it plays out exactly as Joseph said it would. Of course it did, because it was revealed by God. There was 7 fantastic years where he stored all the grain they possibly could. And then when the 7 years of famine hit, it was severe. And not just severe in Egypt, but severe in all the known world at the time. And this, what I love is that this chapter ends in verse 56 and 57. So the famine had spread over all the land. So then Joseph opened all the storehouses. And he was able to because he had storehouses. He opens all the storehouses, sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land. Moreover, verse 57, all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain because the famine was severe over all the earth. What had happened, what you see revealed in that moment, is that everything Joseph had gone through had been sovereignly controlled by God. Yes, it had been humbling this one man and putting him through some discomfort, but it didn't break him. It made him into someone who could save most of the known world from famine at the time. Are we the kind of people who are willing to be discomforted but used by God to be a blessing to many? Joseph's story is going to continue, and a little bit of the foreshadowing is that it says people from all over the earth came to buy grain, and as we'll see, that includes his brothers who rejected him. But until then, keep reading the story for yourself. Keep reflecting on the beauty of God sovereignly controlling the life of Joseph and working to bring about ultimate good for God's glory, because Joseph loves God and seeks to do his will. We can learn so much from Joseph. But until I see you again, listen, stay safe, wash your hands, don't forget to pray, don't forget that we miss you, we love you, we can't wait to be meeting here again in person. Certainly it's not far off. But until then, know I love you, reach out if you need anything, and God bless.